I cracked a plank of English oak clean down the middle once, and that failure taught me more than 20 good years at the bench ever did. It happened at a heritage yard in Essex. I had a fine length of oak clamped to a form, a come-along cinched tight, and I kept cranking, forcing that board into a curve. I could hear the fibers protesting. I kept going anyway. Then came the sound, a dull, wet tearing, and the board split down its length like a log under a maul. The men who built the Viking longships never fought oak like that. So, how does a boat builder with nothing but an axe, an open fire, and a bucket of seawater bend oak into a curve that holds its shape for 1,000 years? Because that is not an exaggeration. We have pulled Viking ships out of the mud of Norwegian burial mounds. Boats like the Oseberg and the Gokstad, and their oak planking still carries the sweep the builder gave it more than 1,000 years ago. No glue, no steel press, no laminate, just a man who understood the wood better than most of us ever will. I came to all of this the long way round. I spent the first half of my working life building modern furniture and modern joinery, trusting waterproof glue and stainless screws and everything the catalogs told me to trust. And I watched a good deal of it fail. Glue lines that let go in the damp, screws that rusted and split the grain from the inside. It was only when I started rebuilding old wooden boats that I began to understand what the old builders knew. The secret to bending oak is not strength, it is timing, and it is respect. Let me show you the 4 things they understood and how you can use every one of them on your own bench. There are 4 parts to this, and they work as one. First, you choose the wood in the right state, green and freshly cut, not dried. Second, you split it instead of sawing it, so the grain runs true. Third, you soften it with heat and water before you ever ask it to move. And fourth, for the sharpest curves, you let a tree do the bending for you. Get these 4 right, and oak will follow your hand like rope. Get them wrong, and you will hear that same tearing sound I heard in Essex. Let's start with the wood itself, because this is where nearly everyone goes wrong before they have even picked up a tool. When you buy oak from a timber merchant today, it is seasoned, dried either in the open air for years or forced in a kiln, down to a low moisture content, so it stays stable in a centrally heated house. That is exactly what you want for a tabletop. It is exactly what you do not want for bending. A dried oak board has set its shape. The fibers have locked. Ask that board to take a curve and it will resist you, and past a certain point it will not bend, it will break. That is what I was fighting on that form in Essex, and I lost. The Viking builders never touched seasoned timber for their planking. They felled the oak, and they worked it green, wet, straight from the living tree, often within days. Green oak is full of sap and moisture, and that moisture is the whole trick. Wood is what we call hygroscopic, which is a long word for a simple thing. It means wood drinks in water and gives it back out, and it swells and shrinks and softens as it does. A living plank, still heavy with its own sap, is soft in a way a dried one can never be. The fibers slide. The plank gives. You can ease it around a frame with your hands and a few wedges where a dried board would have snapped in your face. I learned this properly from an old Norwegian boat builder named Halvard, a man who had forgotten more about oak than I will ever know. He took a green stave and a dry one of the same size and had me try to bow each across my knee. The dry one barely moved before it groaned. The green one came round like a longbow and sprang back straight. Same tree, same grain. All the difference was the water still in it. He said, "And I have never forgotten it, that you cannot bend a plank that has already made up its mind." Now, you are probably thinking, you cannot exactly go and fell an oak in the back garden, and you would be right, but you have more options than you think. Small coppice wood, fresh green offcuts from a tree surgeon, a log split down while it is still wet, any of these will serve you far better than a kiln-dried board for a curved part. When I need to bend a piece for a garden gate or the curved back of an outdoor bench, I keep my stock green on purpose. I split it from a fresh log, I keep it wrapped in damp hessian in the shade, and I work it the same week. If it starts to dry on you, you can bring some life back into it with water and heat, and we will come to that. But nothing you do later fully replaces starting with wood that is still alive. Choose the right wood in the right state, and you have won half the battle before you have made a single cut. And here is something worth holding on to for later. The state of the wood decides how much heat and water you will need down the line. Start green, and you may barely need to steam it at all. That seemed like a small detail to me once. It wasn't. Before we go further, I gathered everything I know about working oak this way into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. 150 pages on the old methods, including how to rive your own planks and make wooden tree nails that swell and tighten with age instead of loosening like a screw. If building things that outlast you appeals to you, the link is in the description below. All right, here is where it gets interesting, because choosing green wood is only the first part. How you break that wood down matters just as much. The second thing the Viking builders understood was how to open a log, and they did not saw their planks. They split them, and there is a world of difference between the two. Splitting wood along its length is called riving, and it is one of the oldest and most beautiful skills in the whole craft. When you saw a board, the saw cuts straight through the grain, across the natural lines of the wood, no matter how the fibers actually run. You get a board that looks right, but has short grain running off its edges, weak points where it wants to break. When you rive a log, instead, the split follows the grain. It runs along the fibers, around them, the way water finds its own path downhill. The plank that comes off has grain running true from one end to the other, unbroken. The Norse builders would take a great oak log and split it like a cake, halving it, then quartering it, then splitting each quarter again into thin wedge-shaped planks that ran from the outside of the tree and toward the heart. We call that radial splitting because the planks radiate out from the center like spokes on a wheel. And radially split oak has a hidden gift. If you look at the end of an oak log, you will see faint ribbons running from the center outward. Those are the medullary rays, sheets of cells that run crosswise to the growth rings, split along them, and the oak is astonishingly strong, and it bends in a fair, even curve without twisting. A radially riven plank is thin, light, true, and willing. It wants to bend the right way. This is the secret behind those long, clean strakes on a Viking hull, the overlapping planks that run the length of the boat. They were thin, sometimes not much more than an inch, riven so fine and so true that they could be sprung around the curve of the frames while still green and simply held there. You do not need a whole longship to use this. Rive your curved parts from a log instead of buying a sawn board, keep them thin, and you will feel the wood cooperate in a way that sawn timber never quite does. Thin and true beats thick and forced every time. That is a rule worth carving over the bench. An old shipwright at the Essex yard warned me about the next part before I ever tried it. He said more good oak is ruined by rushing the heat than by any other mistake. He was right, and I ignored him once, and I paid for it. So now you have the right wood, green and riven true. The third part is how you make it move, and this is where heat and water come in. Even good green oak has its limits, and for a real curve, you help it along by softening the fibers before you bend. Inside every piece of wood, there is a natural glue that holds the fibers together. We call it lignin. It is what makes wood stiff, and lignin has a wonderful quality. When you heat it, especially with moisture present, it softens and goes plastic, and while it is warm, the whole plank becomes pliable. Let it cool, and the linen sets hard again, locking the wood into whatever shape you were holding. That is the entire principle. Warm it to move it, cool it to keep it. The Vikings did this with the tools they had. They soaked their planks in water, sometimes seawater, to drive moisture deep into the fibers, and they warmed them over open fires, turning them, easing them, working the heat along the length of the plank until it grew supple. Some builders steamed them, holding the wood over a trough of boiling water, or burying it in wet seaweed on hot stones, so the steam did the work. You want wet heat here. Dry heat scorches and weakens the fibers, while moist heat softens them right through. Once that plank was warm and willing, they would bend it over the frames of the boat, the ribs that give the hull its shape, and hold it there while it cooled and dried and set to the curve. And here is the part people always ask me about. What holds it while it sets? Not a machine. In the old way, you hold it with wedges, with pegs, with rope lashings, with your own weight and a length of timber braced against the shop wall. The frame is the form. The lashing is the clamp. I have bent many a plank with nothing but a bucket of hot water, a rope, and patience. That is your clamp. And you must let it cool fully before you release it, because the moment you take the pressure off too early, the wood remembers where it came from and springs back. Give it time, trust the wood. I learned that the hard way when I freed a steam plank after 20 minutes because I was impatient and wanted my supper. It sprang half straight overnight, and I had to do the whole thing again the next morning. Heat and water buy you the bend. Only patience makes it stay. And yet, for the very sharpest curves on a Viking ship, the soaring rise of the bow and the stern, the builders barely bent anything at all. The same men who mastered steam and fire knew when not to use it. This is the fourth part, and it is the one that separates people who understand wood from people who only work it. Look at the front of a Viking longship, that great sweeping curve rising up out of the water into the carved prow. You cannot get a curve like that by bending a straight plank. Push oak too far, and it fails, no matter how green or how warm. So the old builders did not try. Instead, they went into the forest, looking for trees that had already grown the shape they needed. Where an oak branch meets the trunk, where a root sweeps up out of the ground, where a tree leaned against the wind for 50 years, the grain inside grows curved. It follows the bend. The builders called this compass timber, or grown crooks, and they hunted for it, the way you or I might hunt for the perfect board. A curved brace, the sharp turn of a stem, the knee where a rib meets the keel, all of these were cut from timber that had grown that exact curve, so the grain ran unbroken around the bend. Think about that for a moment. A part cut from a naturally curved limb is far stronger than the same shape sawn from a straight plank, because the grain follows the curve instead of being cut across it. Nature did the bending, slowly, over decades, and it did it better than any clamp ever could. Good shipwrights would walk the woods for years, noticing trees, remembering a particular crook or fork, sometimes even training young trees to grow into useful shapes for the next generation to cut. They were planting curves. I do a smaller version of this myself. When I am walking and I see a fallen branch with a fair sweep to it, or a hedge-laid stem with a natural bend, I bring it home and I put it in the dry store, because one day I will need exactly that curve for a bracket, or a chair arm, or a boat part, and no steam box on earth will match the strength of a limb that grew that way. So do not force every curve. Learn to see the curves that already exist in the timber and in the trees around you and use them. The strongest bend in oak is often the one you never had to make. Now put the four together, because that is where the real understanding lives. Choose the wood green and full of sap, so the fibers are soft. Rive it radially, so the grain runs true and it bends without twisting. Soften it with wet heat when you need a curve, and hold it patiently until it cools and sets. And for the sharpest sweeps, do not bend at all. Let a grown crook carry the curve for you. The Vikings did not have one clever trick. They had a whole way of seeing wood as a living material that would give you almost anything if you asked it in the right order. The mistakes are the mirror of the rules. Forcing dried timber, sawing when you should have riven, rushing the heat, or releasing the bend before it cools. Reaching for a steam box when a walk in the woods would have handed you the curve already grown. Every failure I have had, including that split plank in Essex, came from ignoring one of these four. Get them right, and you can shape oak into curves that will still be holding their line long after you and I are gone. You do not have to take my word for it. You can dig the proof out of a Norwegian burial mound. I still have a piece of that oak I cracked in Essex all those years ago. I kept it on the shop wall as a reminder. For a long time, I thought it was a monument to my own stubbornness, and I suppose it is. But now I look at it differently. That plank did not fail because oak is weak. It failed because I asked it to do something I had not earned the right to ask, in a state it could not give. The wood was never the problem. I was. Learn to work with the grain instead of against it, and oak will hold your curve for 1,000 years. If you want the full method, it is all in my book, Secrets of the Shipyard. 16 chapters on watertight faying without glue, the old ways of preserving wood with pitch, tallow, and linseed oil, and 3 complete build projects. Scan the code on your screen to find it. And if this ocean-tested, centuries-lasting woodworking is what you love, subscribe to the Master Shipwright and build alongside me.